Today we're going to be doing 12.3, which is introducing percents.
A percent is a ratio that compares a number to 100. The symbol for percent is the percent sign. You can write a percent as a fraction with a denominator of 100.
So key things you need to know in here. A percent is a ratio that always compares a number to 100. The symbol for percent is the percent sign. And you can write a percent as a fraction with the denominator of 100. So if I say something is 20%, it'll always be written as 20 over 100, where 100 is my denominator.
This grid has 100 squares. "45 of the 100 squares are shaded. 45% of the squares are shaded. The fraction 45 100ths is equal to 45%. "45 out of 100 equals 45%.
Again, remember 100 is always the number that is being compared to your percent. So 45% is equivalent to 45 over 100. Complete each statement about the types of video games sold. Blank percent of the games are sold to sports games. So I need to look down here, and purple is sports. Well, I know this column is 10, this is 10, and this is 10. So 10 plus 10 plus 10 gives me 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. Well, I know 35% of the games were sold were sports games. And I know that because this grid is out of 100. Blank percent more sports games than strategy games were sold. So sports was 35. Strategy is going to be 10, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So they want to know how many more percent-wise sports games were sold than strategy games. Well, if sports was 35 and strategy is 25, how can I figure out how many more sports video games were sold than strategy? Well, subtract 35, because 35 sports, minus 25 will give me 10, which means 10% more sports games were sold than strategy games. Okay, blank percent of the games sold were not racing games. Well, I know 10, 20, 30, 40% were racing. And if I have 100 squares here, how can I figure out how many were not racing? Well, 100% minus 40% were racing will give me 60% were not racing. More blank games were sold than any other type. Well, if this was sports, and sports was 35, strategy was 25, how many were racing? Well, 40% were racing. Go ahead and fill that out with me.
35 of the squares are shaded purple. 35 out of 100 equals 35%. This means that 35% of the games sold were sports games. 25 of the squares are shaded orange. 25 out of 100 equals 25%. So 25% of the games sold were strategy games. 40 of the squares are shaded green. 40 out of 100 equals 40%. So 40% of the games sold were racing games. Part A. 35 of the 100 squares are purple. So 35% of the games sold are sports games. Part B. Find the difference between sports games and strategy games. 35% of the games were sports games. 25% of the games were strategy games. 35% minus 25% equals 10%. 10% more sports games than strategy games were sold. Part C. Find the percent of games sold that were sports or strategy games. 35% plus 25% equals 60%. 60% of the games sold were not racing games. Part D. Order the percents from greatest to least. 40% is greater than 35%, which is greater than 25%. The greatest percent is 40%, so more racing games were sold than any other type of game.
What percent of the crossword puzzle is black? So again, I'm going to have you solve this. You know that there are 100 squares total. So you need to go through and figure out what percent of the shaded parts are black. Here are possible answer choices. Go ahead and write your answer. Freeze your screen. And I'm going to move on to part 2. On to part 2.
Math gives us a common language to use. Percents are a shorthand way of saying out of 100. So every percent is a comparison to 100. Here's how I remember that. I think about dollars and cents. There are 100 pennies in a dollar. So 100 cents is 100% of a dollar. Easy, huh? Although fitting all these pennies in my pockets isn't easy at all.
So for this, what you need to know is that the ratio, fraction, and percent are all related. So if I have a ratio 1 to 2 that I know is equal to a number out of 100, how would I figure out this number? Well, to get from 2 to 100, I'm going to multiply by 50, which means if I do that there, I need to do this up here. So I have 50 over 100. So go ahead and write 50 in this box. And if I have 50 over 100, well, my percent is always that top number. So that means I have 50%. Okay, let's try this next one. Blank to 10, so I'm going to have a number over 10, is equal to 10 over 100. So you need to ask yourself, how am I going to figure this out? Well, to get from 100 to 10, I know I'm getting smaller, so I must be dividing. I'm dividing by 10. So if I divide by 10 here, I need to divide by 10 up here. What you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. Well, 10 divided by 10 is 1. And I always have to look at the fraction that's compared to 100 for my percent. So that means 10% is what we're looking at for this fraction. Down here at the bottom, let's try this, okay? I'm going to have a number over 10 again, which is equal to a number over 100. So this one's a little tricky. How do I get from 10 to 100? I multiply by 10. But they gave us 70%. So that's going to help us because we know our percent always comes from the fraction that's compared to 100. So I could just write 70 here because I know 70 over 100 is equal to 70%. So if I know that I'm dividing from 100 to 10 or multiplying from 10 to 100, since I'm going this way, I want to figure out this numerator. I'm going to divide by 10 here. So if I divide by 10 here, I have to divide by 10 here. And 70 divided by 10 is 7. So I know this will be 7. And this right here is 70. Go ahead and freeze your screen. I am moving on. Go ahead and write 3 over 100 as a percent. And I am going to create another video for part 3. So when you're done with part 1 and part 2 and you've answered this with one of these answer choices, go ahead and go on to my Weebly for part 3.